On the morning of July 11th, 1882, the sun rose over the Mediterranean Sea to reveal a terrifying sight to the citizens of Alexandria. The horizon, which was usually dotted with fishing boats and merchant vessels, was filled with dark iron shapes. It was the British Royal Navy, the most powerful military machine on the planet. 8 massive ironclad battleships, including the HMS Inflexible and the HMS Monarch, were maneuvering into battle formation. Their heavy guns trained not on an enemy fleet, but on the dusty fortifications and the crowded residential districts of the Egyptian city. Inside the city, panic was spreading. The people of Alexandria understood that they were not about to be attacked because of a border dispute or a religious crusade or a diplomatic insult. They were about to be bombarded because of a ledger. They were about to be crushed by high explosive shells because their government had missed a mortgage payment. To understand how the British Empire, which prided itself on being a beacon of civilization and the rule of law, arrived at the point where it was willing to burn a city to the ground to satisfy a syndicate of bondholders, we have to wind the clock back 20 years. We have to look at the dream that destroyed Egypt. It was a dream of modernity, and it was dreamed by one man, Khedive Ismail. Ismail the Magnificent, as he came to be known, ascended to the throne of Egypt in 1863. Egypt at that time was technically a province of the Ottoman Empire, but in reality it functioned as a semi-independent state ruled by the dynasty of Muhammad Ali. When Ismail took power, he looked across the Mediterranean at the gaslit boulevards of Paris and the industrial smoke of London, and he felt a burning ambition. He did not want Egypt to be a backward agricultural province of a dying Ottoman Empire. He famously declared, "My country is no longer in Africa, we are now part of Europe." He wanted to build a modern state with railways and telegraphs and opera houses and a European-style army. He wanted to turn Cairo into the Paris on the Nile. And for a brief, fleeting moment, it seemed like he had the money to do it. History dealt Ismail a lucky hand in the form of the American Civil War. When the Union Navy blockaded the ports of the American South, the supply of cotton to the textile mills of Britain and France was cut off. The price of cotton on the global market skyrocketed. It became known as white gold. Egypt, with its fertile Nile Delta, was perfectly positioned to fill the void. Egyptian farmers stopped growing wheat and started growing cotton. The exports boomed. Gold flowed into the Egyptian treasury in a torrent. The landowners became rich overnight. The Khedive saw his revenues double and then triple. Blinded by this sudden influx of cash, Ismail began the greatest spending spree the Middle East had ever seen. He didn't just build infrastructure, he built an image. He commissioned grand palaces filled with French furniture. He paved the streets of Cairo and installed gas lighting. He built a railway network that was denser per square mile than that of France. He poured millions into the education system, sending students to Europe to learn engineering and medicine. It was a breathless attempt to compress 3 centuries of European development into a single decade. But the centerpiece of his ambition was the Suez Canal. The canal was a joint project with the French engineered by Ferdinand de Lesseps, but Egypt provided the labor and a massive amount of the capital. Tens of thousands of Egyptian peasants died digging the ditch through the desert. Ismail saw the canal not just as a waterway, but as Egypt's ticket to the high table of world powers. In 1869, the canal was finished. To celebrate, Ismail threw the most expensive party in the history of the 19th century. He invited the royalty of Europe, including the Empress Eugenie of France, the Emperor of Austria, and the Crown Prince of Prussia. He built a brand new opera house in Cairo just for the occasion. He commissioned the Italian composer Giuseppe Verdi to write a grand opera, Aida, to premiere there. He built a road from Cairo to the pyramids solely so his guests could drive their carriages in comfort. He served banquets on solid gold plates. The champagne flowed like the waters of the Nile. For a few weeks, Egypt really was the center of the world, and Ismail was the toast of Europe. But while the fireworks were exploding over the Suez Canal, the financial storm clouds were gathering. The American Civil War had ended 4 years earlier. American cotton was flooding back onto the market. The price of Egyptian cotton crashed. The massive revenue stream that Ismail had counted on to fund his dreams evaporated, but the spending did not stop. Ismail had started projects that he could not abandon. To keep the lights on and the construction crews working, he turned to the only source of cash left, the European banks. The bankers of London and Paris, led by houses like the Rothschilds and the Oppenheims, saw Ismail coming from a mile away. They knew he was desperate, and they knew he was financially illiterate. They viewed Egypt not as a nation to be developed, but as a harvest to be reaped. They offered him loans, but on terms that were nothing short of predatory. This was the mechanism of the debt trap. The bankers would issue a loan for, say, £10 million, but they would set the issue price at 70%. This meant that Egypt would only receive £7 million in cash, but the state would owe the full $10 million plus interest. The interest rates were nominally 7%, but because the principal was inflated, the effective interest rate was often 12 or 13%. Ismail signed the papers. He borrowed in 1862. He borrowed in 1864. He borrowed in 1868. And most disastrously, he borrowed in 1873. The 1873 loan was the final nail in the coffin. It was a massive loan intended to consolidate the debts, but the terms were so usurious that Egypt received only a fraction of the money, while the debt load doubled. By the mid-1870s, the situation was mathematically impossible. The Egyptian national debt had risen from £3 million when Ismail took the throne to nearly £100 million. The interest payments alone were consuming more than half of the country's entire tax revenue. The European bankers were no longer just lenders, they were the masters of the Egyptian economy. They pressured Ismail to raise taxes on the peasants, the fellahin. The tax collectors went into the villages with whips, called the kurbash, to beat the farmers until they gave up their last coins, their seed grain, and their livestock. Egypt was being bled dry to pay the coupons of bondholders in London and Paris. Ismail was trapped. He was running a Ponzi scheme of a state, borrowing new money just to pay the interest on the old money. In 1875, the crisis reached a breaking point. A massive debt payment was due in December, and the treasury was empty. The bankers refused to lend any more. Ismail looked around for anything he could sell to stay afloat for a few more months. He realized he had one asset left, the family silver. He owned 44% of the shares in the Suez Canal Company. It was the strategic stake that gave Egypt a voice in its own waterway. Ismail secretly let it be known that the shares were for sale. He hoped the French would buy them, but across the Channel in London, the British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli heard the news. Disraeli was an imperialist who believed that Britain's destiny relied on controlling the trade route to India. The Suez Canal was the jugular vein of the British Empire. He realized that if he bought Ismail's shares, Britain would effectively own the canal. But he had to move fast before the French could mobilize. Parliament was in recess, so he couldn't ask for a vote to release the funds. So Disraeli did something extraordinary. He sent his private secretary to the office of his friend Lionel de Rothschild, the head of the banking dynasty. The secretary asked Rothschild for £4 million sterling immediately. Rothschild famously asked only two questions. First, what is your security? And second, when do you need it? The secretary replied, the British government is the security, and we need it tomorrow. Rothschild picked up a musket grape, ate it, spat out the skin, and said, you shall have it. The deal was done in secret. Britain bought the Khedive's shares. Ismail got his £4 million. It was a huge sum, but it was gone in less than a year, swallowed by the black hole of interest payments. Egypt had lost control of its greatest asset, and it was still broke. Now that Britain was a major shareholder, its attitude toward Egypt changed. It was no longer just a creditor, it was an owner. The British and French governments decided that Ismail was too incompetent to manage the repayment of their citizens' bonds. They intervened directly. In 1876, they forced Ismail to accept a humiliating arrangement known as the dual control. They established a Caisse de la Dette Publique, a public debt commission. This was essentially a bankruptcy court for a country. A British official was placed in charge of the Egyptian revenue, and a French official was placed in charge of the Egyptian expenditure. Think about what that means. The Egyptian government lost the power to decide how to spend its own money. The British and French controllers sat in Cairo and looked at the budget. Their priority was simple pay the banks first. Everything else, education, health, the army, infrastructure, was secondary. They imposed brutal austerity. They cut the pay of the army officers. They fired civil servants. They raised taxes on the starving peasants even higher. They starved the country to feed the debt. The resentment in Egypt began to boil. The Egyptians looked at their Khedive and saw a man who had sold them to foreigners. They looked at the Europeans in Cairo who lived in luxury and paid no taxes thanks to old treaties and saw parasites. A nationalist movement began to stir. It was led by a charismatic army officer named Colonel Ahmed Urabi. Urabi was a man of the people, the son of a village sheikh. He spoke for the fellahin and the native Egyptian soldiers who were being discriminated against in favor of the Turkish elite and the European advisors. His slogan was simple and electrifying Egypt for the Egyptians. In 1879, the European powers decided that Ismail was more trouble than he was worth. He was trying to resist their austerity measures to save his own skin, so they pulled the strings. They pressured the Ottoman Sultan in Constantinople, who was technically Ismail's overlord, to fire him. A telegram arrived at the Abdin Palace in Cairo, addressed to the ex-Khedive Ismail. He was deposed. He packed his jewels and his family onto his royal yacht and sailed into exile, leaving behind a ruined country and a mountain of debt. His son Tewfik was placed on the throne. Tewfik was a puppet, weak and terrified, willing to sign whatever the British and French put in front of him. But while the Khedive was submissive, the people were not. The Urabi movement exploded. It wasn't just a military mutiny, it was a national revolution. Urabi demanded a constitution. He demanded that the Egyptian parliament have the right to vote on the budget. This was a direct threat to the European Debt Commission. If the Egyptian parliament could control the budget, they might decide to spend money on food for the people instead of interest payments to the Rothschilds. To the British government in London, led by Prime Minister William Gladstone, this looked like anarchy. Gladstone was a liberal who hated imperial expansion, but he was also a man who understood the sanctity of contracts. The British press whipped up a frenzy, claiming that Urabi was a dangerous radical, an Islamic fanatic, and a threat to the Suez Canal. They ignored the fact that Urabi was actually demanding democratic rights and fiscal sovereignty. The tension escalated throughout 1881 and early 1882. Urabi forced the Khedive to appoint him Minister of War. He effectively took control of the government. The British and French sent their fleets to Alexandria to intimidate the nationalists. They thought the sight of the ironclads would scare the Egyptians into submission. This was the classic gunboat diplomacy that had worked so many times before in China and Africa, but this time it backfired. The presence of the foreign warships in the harbor enraged the population of Alexandria. Riots broke out in the city. Europeans were attacked in the streets. The situation spiraled out of control. The British admiral on the scene, Admiral Seymour, was looking for an excuse to act. He claimed that the Egyptians were strengthening the fortifications of Alexandria and training their guns on his ships. He issued an ultimatum: stop the construction, or we will fire. Urabi refused. He said he would not surrender Egyptian sovereignty to a foreign fleet. And so we returned to the morning of July 11th, 1882. The ultimatum expired. Admiral Seymour gave the signal. The massive turret guns of the HMS Inflexible roared. The bombardment of Alexandria lasted for 10 hours. The British ships rained thousands of shells onto the city. The forts were pulverized. The stray shells hit the city center, starting fires that swept through the wooden buildings. By the time the smoke cleared a significant portion of Alexandria, the pearl of the Mediterranean was in ruins. Hundreds of Egyptians were dead. But the bombardment was not the end, it was the beginning. The British had destroyed the city, but they had not defeated the nationalist movement. Urabi withdrew his army into the interior and declared a holy war against the invaders. The British government faced a choice. They could sail away and leave Egypt to chaos, which would mean a default on the debt and the loss of the Suez Canal, or they could land troops. Gladstone, the man who hated empire, looked at the balance sheet. British bondholders owned the majority of the Egyptian debt. British shipping depended on the canal. The City of London demanded order. He gave the order to invade. A British expeditionary force, led by General Garnet Wolseley, landed in the canal zone. They moved swiftly to secure the waterway, which was the only thing they really cared about. Then they marched into the desert to hunt down Urabi's army. The two forces met at the Battle of Tel El Kebir on September 13th, 1882. It was a massacre. The British army, professional, disciplined, and armed with modern machine guns, attacked at dawn. The Egyptian conscripts, tired, hungry, and demoralized by the bombardment, broke and ran. The battle was over in less than an hour. British cavalry rode straight to Cairo. They seized the citadel. They arrested Urabi. They reinstated the puppet Khedive Tewfik. The revolution was crushed. The debt collectors had won. But the British had broken something they couldn't fix. They had destroyed the Egyptian government. They couldn't just leave now, because if they did, the nationalists would rise again, or another power like France would step in. So they stayed. Gladstone promised the world that the occupation was temporary. He said the British troops would leave as soon as order was restored. He believed it. But weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. This was the beginning of the Veiled Protectorate. Egypt was still officially part of the Ottoman Empire. It still had a Khedive. It still had a government. But behind every Egyptian minister sat a British advisor who told him what to do. And at the top of this system sat the British consul general, a man named Evelyn Baring, later known as Lord Cromer. Cromer was not a soldier. He was a banker. He came from the Baring banking family. He was sent to Cairo with one overriding mission: to balance the books. He was the liquidator-in-chief. Under Cromer's regime, Egypt was run like a bankrupt company undergoing restructuring. He slashed government spending on education, leaving a generation of Egyptians illiterate. He cut spending on health. He focused the entire economy on one thing: growing cotton to export to Britain to earn the hard currency needed to pay the debt. The debt payments were met. The coupons were paid on time. The value of Egyptian bonds on the London Stock Exchange soared. The British investors got their money back with interest. But Egypt ceased to be a sovereign nation. It became a plantation for the textile mills of Lancashire and a toll booth for the Suez Canal. The occupation, which was supposed to last a few months, lasted for 74 years. British troops would not leave the Suez Canal zone until 1956. The bombardment of Alexandria and the subsequent invasion marked a turning point in the history of the world. It kicked off the scramble for Africa as other European powers rushed to grab territory to protect their own interests. But more importantly, it established a precedent for the modern age. It proved that finance was the new imperialism. You didn't need to colonize a country to settle it. You just needed to lend it money, wait for it to falter, and then use the military to enforce the foreclosure. The shells that fell on Alexandria were not fired for glory or for religion or for territory. They were fired to ensure that a check written in London did not bounce in Cairo. It was the first modern war for debt, and it changed the Middle East forever. The British occupation of Egypt, which began in 1882, was one of the strangest political constructs in the history of imperialism. It was a regime built entirely on a lie. The British government, led by Prime Minister Gladstone, kept insisting to the world and to the British public that they were not staying. They claimed they were only there to restore order, to support the Khedive, and to ensure the safety of the Suez Canal. Once these modest goals were achieved, the soldiers would leave. Gladstone famously stated, "We have no desire to annex Egypt. We have no desire to govern Egypt." But in reality, the boots of the British Army had sunk deep into the mud of the Nile Delta, and the claws of the British banking system had dug even deeper into the Egyptian treasury. The occupation, which was promised to last months, would stretch on for 74 years. To understand how a temporary police action turned into a permanent colonial possession, we have to look at the man who was sent to Cairo to clean up the mess. His name was Evelyn Baring, later known to history as Lord Cromer. He was not a general. He was not a diplomat in the traditional sense. He was a scion of the Baring banking family, one of the most powerful financial dynasties in the world. He had banking in his blood. He viewed the world through the lens of a balance sheet. When he arrived in Cairo in 1883 as the British consul general, he did not see a country with a rich history and a vibrant culture. He saw a distressed asset, he saw a company in receivership, and he appointed himself the CEO. Cromer established a system of government known as the Veiled Protectorate. It was a masterpiece of political camouflage. On the surface, nothing changed. The Khedive Tewfik still sat in the Abdin Palace. The Egyptian ministers still held their titles. The Ottoman flag still flew over the citadel. The official language of the court was still Turkish and Arabic, but behind every Egyptian minister sat a British advisor. And the rule was simple. The Egyptian minister could say whatever he wanted, but he had to do whatever the British advisor told him. If he refused, he was fired. At the very top of this pyramid sat Lord Cromer. He ruled Egypt from the British Agency, a modest building compared to the Khedive's palaces, but it was the true seat of power. Cromer's primary directive from London was not to improve the lives of the Egyptian people. It was not to build a democracy. It was to make sure the coupons were paid. His job was to squeeze enough profit out of the Egyptian economy to satisfy the bondholders in London and Paris who held the Egyptian debt. To do this, Cromer fundamentally restructured the Egyptian economy. He turned the entire nation into a cotton plantation. In the late 19th century, the textile mills of Lancashire and England were the industrial engine of the British Empire. They had an insatiable hunger for raw cotton. Egypt, with its long, staple cotton and its unending sunshine, was the perfect supplier. Cromer directed almost all state investment into irrigation. He repaired the great barrages on the Nile. He dug thousands of miles of canals. He reformed the water distribution system. On paper, this looked like development. Agricultural output soared. The desert bloomed. But this was not development for the sake of the Egyptians. It was development for the sake of the debt. The irrigation system was designed to maximize the cotton harvest for export, not the wheat harvest for food. Egypt, which had been the breadbasket of Rome in ancient times, began to import food to feed its own population because its best land was devoted to growing fiber for British looms. The profits from this cotton boom were immense, but they did not stay in Egypt. They flowed directly into the Caisse de la Dette, the Public Debt Commission. This organization, run by European commissioners, had absolute veto power over Egyptian spending. Before the Egyptian government could spend a single piastre on a school or a hospital or a road, it had to get permission from the Caisse. And the Caisse almost always said no. Their priority was debt service. Under Cromer's regime, taxation became a science. He abolished some of the more barbaric practices of the past, like the kourbash, the whip used by tax collectors to beat peasants, but he replaced the whip with the efficiency of the bureaucrat. The tax collectors became relentless. They knew exactly how much every feddan of land produced, and they took their cut with mathematical precision. The Egyptian peasant, the fellow, was no longer beaten, but he was still impoverished. He worked from dawn to dusk, growing cotton he could not eat to pay taxes to a government. He did not choose to satisfy a debt he did not incur. This economic strangulation had consequences beyond the borders of Egypt. To the south lay the vast territory of the Sudan. Technically, the Sudan was an Egyptian possession. It had been conquered by the Khedives earlier in the century. But holding the Sudan cost money. It required garrisons of soldiers, administrative outposts, and supply lines stretching thousands of miles up the Nile. As the debt commissioners in Cairo tightened the belt, they slashed the budget for the Sudan. The Egyptian garrisons there were unpaid. Their uniforms were ragged. Their weapons were old. The administration became corrupt and predatory, trying to extract taxes from the Sudanese tribes to make up for the lack of funding from Cairo. This created a power vacuum, and into this vacuum stepped a man named Muhammad Ahmad, who declared himself the Mahdi, the chosen one. He led a religious revolt against the foreign oppressors. The Mahdist uprising swept across the Sudan like a firestorm. The unpaid, demoralized Egyptian troops were slaughtered. In London, the government of William Gladstone watched the collapse of the Sudan with horror. They didn't want to get involved. They wanted to balance the books in Egypt, not fight a holy war in the middle of Africa. They ordered the evacuation of the Sudan. They sent General Charles Gordon, a famous war hero and a deeply eccentric man, to Khartoum to organize the retreat. But Gordon disobeyed orders. He refused to abandon the city. He got besieged. The siege of Khartoum in 1884 and 1885 became a Victorian melodrama played out in the press. The British public demanded a rescue mission. But the government hesitated because a rescue mission would cost millions of pounds and the Egyptian treasury was empty. By the time a relief column finally arrived, it was too late. Khartoum had fallen. General Gordon was dead, his head cut off and displayed on a pike. The loss of the Sudan was a direct result of the debt crisis. Egypt lost a territory the size of Western Europe because it could not afford the cash to hold it. It was a geopolitical amputation to save the financial body. Back in Cairo, Lord Cromer used the disaster to consolidate his power. He argued that the Egyptians were clearly incapable of managing their own military affairs. He disbanded the remnants of the Egyptian army and rebuilt it from scratch, commanded entirely by British officers. The Sirdar, the commander-in-chief of the Egyptian army, was now an Englishman. For the next 20 years, the debt payments flowed like clockwork. The bondholders in London grew rich. The stock price of Egyptian securities became the gold standard of safety. Cromer was hailed in the city of London as a financial genius. He was given an earldom. He was called the maker of modern Egypt. But beneath the surface, resentment was festering. The Egyptians watched as their country became a playground for Europeans. Under the system of capitulations, foreigners in Egypt were exempt from Egyptian law. They didn't pay taxes. If a British subject committed a crime in Cairo, he couldn't be tried by an Egyptian judge. He had to be tried by a British consular court, which would almost certainly let him go. Cairo and Alexandria became divided cities. There was the European quarter with its electricity, its cafes, and its paved roads, where the French, Italian, and Greek communities lived in splendor. And then there were the native quarters where the sewage ran in the streets and the schools were crumbling because the budget had been slashed to pay the debt. The tension exploded in 1906 in a small village called Dinshawai. A group of British officers went pigeon shooting near the village. They accidentally shot a local woman. The villagers attacked the officers with sticks. In the confusion, one British officer died of heat stroke. The British reaction was hysterical and brutal. They wanted to send a message. They set up a special tribunal. 4 villagers were sentenced to death by hanging. Others were sentenced to flogging and hard labor. The executions were carried out in public in the village square. The families of the condemned were forced to watch. The Dinshawai incident shattered the myth of the benevolent occupation. It revealed the ugly face of the debt collector. It showed that behind the balance sheets and the irrigation projects lay the brute force of the gallows. It galvanized a new generation of Egyptian nationalists, led by Mustafa Kemal, who demanded the end of the occupation, but the British couldn't leave. They were trapped by their own financial logic. If they left, they argued the Egyptian economy would collapse, the debt payments would stop, and another power, perhaps France or Germany, would step in to seize the canal. The debt had become the justification for the empire. When World War I broke out in 1914, the pretense of the veiled protectorate was finally dropped. The Ottoman Empire joined the war on the side of Germany. Technically, Egypt was still part of the Ottoman Empire. This created a legal paradox where the British were occupying a province of an enemy state. Britain solved this by declaring a formal protectorate over Egypt. They deposed the Khedive Abbas Hilmi, who was anti-British, and replaced him with his uncle Hussein Kamel, who was given the title of Sultan. Egypt was now officially severed from the Ottomans and attached to the British Empire. The war was a boom time for the Egyptian economy. The British army flooded into the country to defend the Suez Canal. They bought grain camels and labor. The price of cotton soared again. Egypt actually paid off some of its foreign debt during the war years, but the political debt was accumulating. The Egyptians had been promised that if they supported the war effort, they would be granted independence once the fighting stopped. Egyptian peasants were conscripted into the labor corps and sent to dig trenches in France and Palestine. Thousands died. When the war ended in 1918, the Egyptian nationalists led by Saad Zaghloul demanded to go to the Paris Peace Conference to plead their case for independence. The British refused. They arrested Zaghloul and exiled him to Malta. This triggered the revolution of 1919. It was a nationwide uprising. Students, workers, peasants, and even women marched in the streets. They cut railway lines. They burned police stations. It was the first time that the British faced a united Egyptian nation. The British realized they could no longer rule by force alone. It was too expensive. They needed a new arrangement. In 1922, they issued a unilateral declaration of Egyptian independence. But it was a fake independence. It was independence with reservations. The British retained control over 4 key areas: the security of imperial communications, the Suez Canal, the defense of Egypt against foreign aggression, the protection of foreign interests and minorities, and the administration of the Sudan. Crucially, the financial shackles remained. The Egyptian economy was still pegged to the British pound. The cotton trade was still dominated by Liverpool. The foreign debt, though reduced, was still a massive burden on the state budget. The capitulations that exempted foreigners from taxes remained in place. For the next 30 years, Egypt lived in a twilight zone. It had a king, a parliament, and a flag, but it was not free. The British ambassador was still the most powerful man in the country. The British troops still occupied the citadel in Cairo and the barracks in the canal zone. The debt trap had evolved into a strategic trap. Britain needed the canal to maintain its empire in India. To pay for the defense of the canal, it needed Egypt to remain economically dependent. It wasn't until 1952 that the cycle was finally broken. A group of army officers led by Gamal Abdel Nasser staged a coup. They overthrew King Farouk, the decadent descendant of Ismail. They exiled the royal family. They declared a republic. Nasser's revolution was driven by the memory of the debt. He remembered the humiliation of the Khedive bowing to the bankers. He remembered the cotton being shipped away while the people ate beans. In 1956, as we saw in the previous stories, Nasser completed the liberation by nationalizing the Suez Canal. When he seized the canal company, he was essentially repossessing the asset that had been stolen from Egypt 80 years earlier. He was canceling the foreclosure. The British bombardment of Alexandria in 1882 serves as a dark milestone in the history of capitalism. It was the moment when the mask slipped. It proved that the liberal ideals of the 19th century free trade, sovereignty, property rights were secondary to the imperatives of finance. When a country gets into a debt trap, it loses more than just money. It loses its agency. Its government ceases to answer to its people and begins to answer to its creditors. The taxes collected in the village are not spent in the village. They are wired to a bank in a foreign capital. The legacy of the Khedive's debt is written on the map of the Middle East. It created a deep and lingering suspicion of Western financial institutions. It taught the region that a loan is never just a loan. It is a lever. And if you pull that lever hard enough, you can topple a government, occupy a country, and rewrite history. The shelling of Alexandria was the ultimate collection call. It demonstrated that in the geopolitics of the 19th century, the battleships was the final clause in the loan agreement. And while the battleships have changed, the logic of the debt trap remains the same. The golden handcuffs are the hardest ones to break. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.